Okay, we're going to take a look at the case study for the end of our educational law class. So, first, looking at the scenario presented and what the facts are in this situation. Essentially, what's happened is that an educator has reported to their principal that software copyright violations are taking place in St. Regis schools. Other educators in the building have asked the library media specialist to make copies of purchased software for use in their individual classrooms. A single copy of software was originally purchased for use in the computer lab or in an individual classroom, but not in multiple classrooms. And then, when a staff member and then an administrator asked the library media specialist about this, they were not concerned about the copyright violations. So, looking at the order of events, over the last 3 years, St. Regis Schools has directed some of their fundraising monies to purchase computers and then software for the school. The software purchases were prioritized by the PTA and faculty and then was purchased. It was coordinated by the principal and the library media specialist. And I think it needs to be said that the librarian took on additional responsibilities as technology became more enmeshed in St. Regis schools, working as a computer lab teacher in addition to her regular duties. So the computers were initially used in a single location and then were spread out to different classrooms. At that point, those classrooms' teachers asked the media specialist to make copies of the purchased programs. At that point, she purchased flash drives, copied the programs, and distributed them to educators in the building. At that point, one of the educators, who was newer to St. Regis Schools, was aware of copyright law and addressed her concerns directly with the librarian. When her concerns were dismissed, she went ahead and brought them to the administrator. The next day, the administrator went to the librarian, the media specialist, and asked about a pile of flash drives that just happened to be next to a library computer. Um, in the ensuing conversation about copying programs, the librarian disagreed about the seriousness of copyright violation and did not agree to collect the illegally copied materials. At one point, the media specialist actually essentially threatened to go above the administrator and go directly to the PTA board and mention how much money was being saved by her illegally copying the software. So, when we look at the involved parties in the school building and what their opinions are of their actions, first, we definitely want to look at Mrs. Lynn, who is the library and the media specialist. I do want to point out that she has shown dedication to her school building. She has taken on additional responsibilities at St. Regis as the school has used the monies from PTA fundraisers to purchase technology. After classroom teachers requested copies of the purchased software for their own usage, Mrs. Lynn has begun making those copies of the purchased software, but the licenses do not allow for the copies. When confronted about the behavior, she was defiant. She justified her behavior as doing what was best for the students at the school, and she has threatened to circumvent the administrator by taking her case directly to the executive board of the PTA. So then we also want to look at the classroom teachers in the building. And first, we want to look at Mrs. Brandon. Mrs. Brandon is relatively new to St. Regis, and she is the educator who is aware of copyright law due to her experiences in her previous district. She's concerned about the potential liability that the school faces. Mrs. Williams is the other third grade teacher, and she's happy to have the additional copies of the programs. And she has thanked Mrs. Lynn for producing them. In general, the classroom teachers at St. Regis are warming up to their new principal in his third year on the job. They have, though, asked Mrs. Lynn to make the copies of the programs to utilize in their classrooms. And so I think it's important to point out that this is an issue in multiple classes in the school. So it's almost a school-wide awareness issue at this point. We also want to look at the community and what are their opinions, and primarily Mrs. Evans, who is our PTA president. She helped Mrs. Lynn make the copies of software for classroom use. She's happy that the school is making the most of the money raised by the PTA by copying the purchased software. It's also important to point out that the residents of St. Regis are reluctant to accept strangers. Mr. Sample, as the administrator, has actively worked to build positive relationships within the community, and he's been relatively successful over the last 2 years. So then after looking at the information, we want to look at the legal and ethical issues in this case. And at this point, no one has been physically harmed. This is dealing with copyright. This is not dealing with a physically aggressive situation. However, there is some harm in the working relationship between Mrs. Brandon and Mrs. Lynn, and possibly other teachers. When Mr. Sample approached Mrs. Lynn about the flash drives, he did not specifically say, Mrs. Brandon came to me and shared this information with me about copying the software. However, Mrs. Lynn jumped to the conclusion and asked specifically that she didn't understand what Mrs. Brandon's problem was with what she was doing. There's also a potential in this case for the working relationship between the school administration and the community to be negatively impacted. Laws. So the situation might not break existing copyright laws because they can be vague in regards to software. Making multiple copies of a software program purchased for a single use can be a violation of the Copyright Act and therefore would be illegal. Then we also want to look and see if there was a breach of contract. When you purchase a software product with a single-use license, we're entering into a contract with that company saying that it will be used within the parameters of the license. By making multiple copies for usage across the school building, a breach of contract is occurring. So then, just in a single sentence, what is the situation that we're facing? At this point, we must address the legal and ethical issues that have arisen from the illegal copying of software, but at the same time, we also must work to maintain the positive relationships we've built with a community that is resistant to outsiders. So what do we know and what don't we know? It's always important to take a moment and assess that. When we look at the people, we know the opinions of the staff members listed in the previous section. We know that St. Regis School has an active and involved PTA that wants to make a positive impact on the students there. We know that the community as a whole is historically resistant to newcomers, but that Mr. Sample is seeing a payoff in this area after making a concerted effort over the last 2 years to build positive relationships. What we don't know is, in general, what the attitudes of the staff as a whole at St. Regis is towards copyright laws. We also don't know what training those teachers have received in this area in the past. When we look at St. Regis as a community, we know that it is a small rural community. And interestingly enough, although it's a small community, it contains several stores and services that are utilized by those who live in the surrounding area. It's located 25 miles away from a large city. And we also know that generally its population can be resistant to newcomers. We do know, however, that the community is supportive of its local school. The community hosts 2 major fundraisers each year, and that accounts for the funding the school receives other than the small amount that comes from state monies. The money raised by fundraising efforts has been enough to pay for a reasonable amount of technology over the last 3 years. What we don't know is the physical condition of the town. We don't know demographic information of St. Regis other than the fact that it is a rural community. In terms of the program or the building, we know that St. Regis is a public school because it mentions that it takes state monies. It also receives federal funding for special education. It serves close to 420 students in grades K through 8. It has 2 teachers per grade level and 2 SPED teachers, one for primary age and one for intermediate. Um, Interestingly enough, the students in St. Regis community are bused to a school in a large city 25 miles away once they reach high school age. What we don't have a lot of information about the unified school district that St. Regis belongs to. We don't know how many communities feed into the large high school in the city. We don't know the overall structure of the school district and its governance. We don't know how many community members in St. Regis might serve on that school board, or is it from a broader area? We also don't know if the district has adopted any internet acceptable use policies. How we also need to look at the priorities in the situation. So first, how could this damage the community? First, it could damage the community through liability. When the company that produces the illegally copied software becomes aware of the license infringement, and in the era of internet access and programs connecting to the internet for their usage, I have a hard time seeing how a company would not be aware of multiple licenses being used. The school and the school district could be held liable for violation of the software usage agreement. This could also come with a financial cost, and that can be a high cost. I've stated the community of St. Regis puts a high value on maximizing their financial investment to the benefit of their students. The costs, though, associated with liability, the legal costs, the financial penalties, would definitely have a negative impact on the school's ability to provide student support. This situation also has the potential to damage positive working relationships. The administrator has worked hard to develop those relationships with a community that does not readily accept outsiders. Depending on how the situation is handled, the positive working relationship could be demolished, especially if the underlying issue of copyright infringement is not viewed as a serious one. And then additionally, we also need to consider specifically Mrs. Brandon and her working relationship with her colleagues, just because she was the one who initially identified this area of need. So when we look, there are 3 groups that have an important stake in this outcome. And first is always our students. We want to set our students up to be successful and have positive learning experiences. And they're going to feel the impact of any outcome in this situation. At this point, I think it would be safe to say that students have been utilizing the software during independent activities. And they're also going to feel the impact of financial penalties and also the impact of any degrading working relationship between the staff in their building or the staff and the community. In addition, the educators in St. Regis School have gotten used to having access to these resources. This also could really damage the culture of the school. It could divide long-standing staff against those who have been in the building for a relatively short time. We also need to consider the community because, as I stated earlier, St. Regis supports its school through several fundraisers as well as an active and involved PTA. It's obvious that the community places a high value on the school getting the maximum value for the money spent on programs that benefit teachers and students. So it's also important to identify some of the things I need to learn about the situation. And right now, I don't know, as I said earlier, what training the staff at St. Regis has had on copyright infringement. And I'm also not aware of any district level policies that are in place to address these kinds of situations. But the question is, do I have enough information to assess the situation and come up with some options? And yes, I do feel like I have that information. I can identify options, I can evaluate those options and pick one, and then I can develop a plan to implement it. So first, I generated 4 possible options. One exceedingly passive, one exceedingly severe, and 2 that were in the middle. The first option is to take no action and have no further conversation with Mrs. Lynn about copyright infringement. I can allow the proliferation of illegally copied software through my building. And as educators come to me with their concerns, I can either ignore or minimize them. On the other end of the spectrum would be to fire Mrs. Lynn for insubordination. I could collect all copies of the illegally copied software and then fire any educator who is using that software. This is extreme in many ways, but another way I feel this is incredibly extreme is that I would make these moves without any communication. And then also call for the replacement of the PTA president for participating in the illegal copying of software. So neither of those options seem tenable. And I know that at the point that I was generating these, I was not necessarily evaluating them, but at this point I have gone through and evaluated and chosen an option, and neither of them were it. So looking at a couple of intermediate course of actions, this one is a little more severe. Continue to collect all illegal copies of software throughout the building. Instead of firing, going ahead and formally reprimanding Mrs. Lynn and other educators who solicited the illegally copied software and are utilizing it. And then instruct educators to generate alternate independent activities for the students in their classrooms. Then my final intermediate course of action would be to start with communication and communicating the importance of following copyright law, as well as adhering to the licensing agreement of the purchased software to all stakeholders. I need a drink, excuse me. At this point, I'm taking no disciplinary action towards staff unless it's warranted by further action. Collecting the copied software, but identifying areas where alternate work could be generated and then providing staff that time. And then finally, developing a policy outline for acceptable use practices at St. Regis School, and then implement them consistently through the building. And then finally, train staff on copyright laws, rights, procedures, and regulations. So what are the pros and cons of each option? When we look at the most passive option, the pros would be that it's not going to make any waves with pre-existing staff. Mrs. Lynn will continue to be happy doing what she's doing. Veteran teachers at St. Regis, the PTA, and therefore the community. Another pro will be that students will have increased access to the educational software for a time. The cons in this situation are the increased chances of liability action against St. Regis School. The other point is that staff is going to turn over at some point, and as newer staff come on and they're more aware of copyright laws, including Mrs. Brandon, who's already aware of copyright laws, they're going to be disillusioned with the leadership choices that are being made. And finally, this option is ethically wrong. I believe that ethics matter, and what you do, even when you don't know that someone is seeing what you're doing, people are watching you, and people are watching you behave in an ethical manner. Option 2, which was the most severe option, the pro was that it would stop the proliferation of illegal software used at St. Regis. Several cons on this, the primary one being loss of a lot of veteran teachers, and that's going to invariably lead to the disruption of teaching and learning at St. Regis School. You're going to alienate the community. There will be no communication or training, and staff that are left can retaliate against Mrs. Brandon for bringing the concern to administration's attention. Option 3, which was the first intermediate option provided, had several pros and cons. First, it's going to stop proliferation of illegal software at St. Regis. In the short term, no loss of veteran teachers, but if an administrator is going to address the situation by reprimanding multiple teachers, ultimately those teachers could leave. Another pro is that it mentions a need to have alternatives to software usage in the classroom. The cons, veteran teachers are going to become disillusioned with administration. The positive working relationship will be damaged. The positive relationship with the community will be damaged. Again, there's minimal communication with this option, and no training is provided. When we look at option 4, it's an approach that's designed to educate and train staff and stakeholders. It's designed to be communicative. It's designed to stop the proliferation of legal software used at St. Regis School. It's designed to generate alternate independent activities, and it's also designed to develop and implement a consistent policy. The con to this is that if there are staff who are dedicated to continuing to use illegally copied software, there's not an immediate consequence for that behavior. So, after reflecting and picking a solution, probably will not be a lot of a surprise that our plan of action will be built around the steps in option 4. So then we look at implementing our decision and deciding what is our plan of action. The first step is to communicate. I believe that, especially because Mrs. Lynn and Mrs. Evans have worked so closely together on this, and because Mrs. Lynn's first reaction was to go directly to the PTA board, that the best step is to have a face-to-face conversation with Mrs. Lynn and Mrs. Evans. This conversation would need to be positive in tone, and they both deserve to be praised for their dedication to the students at St. Regis, their desire to maximize the financial investment the community makes in the school. But then there's a way to leverage that desire that they have about when we focus on the cost of violating software licenses. We can connect the penalty directly to their desire to get the most benefit from the money available to the school, but then also at the same time reiterate support for students and staff to be successful in ways to find a different solution. And this may take, this may not be a short meeting. This may be multiple meetings, but I do believe that this is an important piece, especially if you're going to maintain that positive working relationship. Once you've communicated with Mrs. Lind and Mrs. Evans, you want to communicate with the staff as a whole, and you essentially want to have the same conversation again, but just on a broader scale. And then finally, again, taking that same information and broadening your audience. Attending PTA meetings and sharing the information there, and then also hosting meetings with the community as a whole if needed. The next thing we want to do is we want to correct the behavior. We want to set expectations for staff regarding using illegally copied software. We want to collect all copies of the software and we want to destroy them. Finally, I think it's important to identify the function of the software and that the independent practice. And then we want to collaborate as teams to find alternate activities that can fulfill the same functionality in the classroom. And an important piece in this specific option is to provide staff members time to do that during their work day, in accordance, of course, always with a negotiated agreement. We want to express to staff that no disciplinary action is going to be taken at this time. This is an opportunity to bring educators in the building together as a community focused on a singular goal, which is to come up with some creative solutions to a problem, to an obstacle that we've encountered. And how can we be creative, work within our software licenses, and still have positive outcomes for our students and staff? Finally, there needs to be some training. If the unified school district that St. Regis School belongs to has an acceptable use policy, we want to train the staff on that policy. However, given the fact that there might not be one, it would be wise to develop one for St. Regis School. And my thought would be to organize a committee, including the administrator and some of the people who have shown that they are um, invested in this process. And to me, those people are Mrs. Lynn, Mrs. Evans, and Mrs. Brandon, and the um, work within the constraints and the parameters of the law and the licensing agreements to come up with an ethical way to utilize those materials. And then finally, we want to train on that policy. We'll also include a training on copyright laws and procedures annually as part of staff development. Finally, it's important, I think, to follow up. And as an administrator, to make it a point to follow up with staff to ensure that those expectations are being followed. And then, unfortunately, if those expectations are not being followed in that area, then we might have to go to disciplinary action. And just going off of what I know from a negotiated agreement, I would prefer to start with an informal conversation and then a verbal disciplinary action and then a formal written. We want to follow up with staff not only in terms of negative, but also to make sure that additional resources could be provided if needed, because we want to help staff and students be successful. If a specific software program is identified that could meet a wide variety of needs, we could contact the developer and see about the cost of a group license. And maybe it's a situation where one program can do the work of several. And so at that point, see, okay, what would that cost be for the building? And is that a feasible path to take? And then finally, Mr. Sample had conducted a survey at the end of his second year. And I think after this year, it would be critical to do that again, just to see and kind of assess the impact this situation has had on the positive working relationship he has with the community. And really, just in conclusion, I feel like this option would be the best path forward to allow for some creative solutions to be developed as a school community in collaboration with the community as a whole. With that, I thank you.